Okay, today, guys, we're going to be looking at the 7.5 indicator, which is going to involve the space race, arms race, a little bit about Cuba, some things going on in the Middle East, and the end of the Cold War. And this is going to be part 3 of 7.5. So if you have already done part 1 and part 2, then this is just a continuation for this. Make sure that you are getting these notes written down. There will be a couple of questions at the end of the presentation. These are sort of like our learning objective questions, and we'll be going over those as we get to the end. First off, we're going to start with the arms race and the space race. Remember, this is going to occur after World War II. Of course, the United States and Soviet Union have become the two superpowers after the war. They're the last two countries, strong countries standing. So they're going to get into a competition between who can produce the most missiles and also who can get as much stuff up into outer space as possible. So we're going to start with the arms race and the space race. Let's sort of do a timeline, and you might want to write down these things for this timeline. And let's start with what happens in August of 1945. Of course, the atomic bomb is dropped in Japan. The United States is going to do that. By November of 1952, we're going to see the hydrogen bomb, which is going to be dropped by the United States. By August of 1957, the first intercontinental ballistic missile would be fired. And of course, an acronym or the prefix, or however you want to say it, ICBM, is going to be used by the Soviet Union. These intercontinental ballistic missiles are missiles that could be fired, and they could go from one continent to another by going almost into outer space. But the Soviet Union is the first to fire off an ICBM. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union would also launch the first satellite into space, which would be Sputnik 1. And on January 1961, a human-like animal was sent into space. And of course, that is going to be a chimpanzee. This is going to be done by the United States. In April of 1961, the first human is launched into space by the Soviet Union. In June of 1965, we have the very first spacewalk, which is going to be done by the Soviet Union. And in July of 1969, we see the first man on the moon. And of course, that's going to be done by the United States. So all of these were competitions between the United States and the Soviet Union during this period. Again, this is going to create fear among the citizens of the United States, because now they're afraid that the Soviet Union could hit us with a nuclear warhead, a nuclear missile. Once the Soviet Union puts Sputnik up into outer space, they're afraid that the Soviet Union is going to start launching missiles from space and hitting the United States. So this is going to create a lot of fear and anguish within the U.S. and in the Soviet Union too as well. This is going to lead to the National Defense of Education Act, and of course, this is when we start seeing a big focus on science and math. And the reason why is because we want to be able to compete with the Soviet Union. Here they are making nuclear warheads. Here they are, getting these things up into outer space. And so the United States realizes that they have to do something to be able to compete. One of the ways that they're going to try to compete is through the National Defense of Education Act. We're also going to see for the first time the duck and cover drills. This was a drill that was done in a lot of schools. We don't do it anymore, but the duck and cover drills were done in case of a nuclear attack. And if you look at a couple of these pictures here on this page, of course, people in the United States built bomb shelters during this period. If you see John F. Kennedy here, he's giving his famous speech that we wanted to put a man on the moon. And of course, he does that in 1961, and it comes to reality by 1969. So again, the arms race, space race starts after World War II, continues through the 1960s, even into the 1970s. Next, we're going to look at the Red Scare. Remember, we've talked about an earlier Red Scare after World War I. Now we're going to look at the second Red Scare. And again, it involves the fear of communists coming into the United States. With the ending of World War II, the Soviet Union becoming our major nemesis or enemy at this point, and the U.S. feared that the communists were going to infiltrate the government. One guy that's going to lead the attack to try to seek out these communists is this guy, Senator McCarthy. He began a witch hunt to try to find these supposed communists that were trying to infiltrate our government. And he accused a lot of people, especially people high up, even people within Congress, of possibly being communist. So McCarthyism arises during the 1950s. We get the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which you see pictured here. They were accused of selling atomic plans to the Russians. Eventually, they were exposed, they were caught, and they were convicted and sentenced to death. Don't forget that the Red Scare, again, McCarthyism, 1950s, fear of communism, those are the main things that you need to know for the Red Scare Part 2. We're going to jump around a little bit, and we're going to go to Cuba next. During the 1950s and before the 1950s, Cuba had been a sort of like an ally of the United States. The government was friendly with the United States, but all that changes in the 1950s when this guy right here, Fidel Castro, comes to power. He's going to lead a coup against the government. He's going to overthrow that U.S. supported government. He's going to overthrow that government, and he is going to develop a relationship with the Soviet Union. The United States is fearful of Fidel Castro, and John F. Kennedy is going to authorize an invasion of Cuba. This invasion is going to be known as the Bay of Pigs. It occurs in 1961. It was mainly done by the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, and it was a failure, unfortunately, for the United States. With the CIA soldiers and some Cuban exiles, these people that had been sort of kicked out of Cuba that did not like Castro, they're going to try to launch this invasion, and Castro is going to find out about it, and the mission is going to fail. It's going to make the United States look very, very bad during this period. Which leads us to the next event, which is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because of the friendly relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba, the Soviet Union is going to place nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba. Spy planes are going to discover these launch pads and these nuclear missiles that have been placed on Cuba. And once the United States finds out about it, it's going to be a pretty tense moment. It's the closest that we've ever come to possibly having a nuclear war. What John F. Kennedy decides to do is he's going to order a naval blockade of Cuba and preventing any shipments coming in from the Soviet Union. Of course, I don't think the book talks about this, but I want you guys to know it. There was a few Soviet Union ships that have been sent to, sort of bring some more missiles into Cuba. You can see where the blockade was on this map. The ship is close to crossing over this line. It gets close, but eventually it turns around. And so nuclear war is going to be diverted. But this fear of nuclear war would go on for about 13 days in 1962. The agreement was reached. And in the agreement, what John F. Kennedy and the guy that you see here, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, what both of these guys decide is that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, and that the United States will remove missiles that were placed in Turkey. And that was sort of the agreement. And they also agreed to have a hotline between the United States and the Soviet Union where if they had issues or problems, that they could contact each other directly. This also led to a nuclear test ban treaty, banning some of the testing that went on for nuclear warheads, and that was done in 1963. In the Middle East, we see communism again trying to spread into other parts of Asia. The United States, again, are fearful of communism. Remember, we talked about the creation of Israel in 1948, which created conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis that were moving there. We get the Suez Crisis in 1956. Again, Eisenhower is going to step in. Eisenhower is going to issue something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. Of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower is president during this period. If you remember anything about Eisenhower, which you see up here in the upper right-hand corner, Eisenhower was also the head of Allied forces in World War II, and now he is president during the 1950s. The Suez Crisis was when some Middle Eastern countries tried to block the Suez Canal, which is a main thoroughfare for a lot of the world's oil. The United States would become involved, and this is when the Eisenhower Doctrine is going to be issued, which means they're going to bring containment to the Middle East and try to keep communism from spreading into the Middle East. Of course, Middle Eastern oil was very important to the U.S. economy. We relied on the Middle East for most of our oil. By the 1970s, we get a crisis with oil when the U.S. stopped the OPEC producing nations, which are the nations that produce the majority of the oil in the Middle East, and they issued an embargo against those oil shipments. And this is going to lead to a crisis where there's going to be long lines at the gas pumps and so on, but eventually that's going to be lifted. We get the Camp David Accords, which was an attempt by the United States to try to help establish peace in the Middle East. And of course, this is the ruler of Egypt, and Jimmy Carter, who's the president of the United States in the late 1970s. And this is Menachem Begin, who was also the head of Israel during that time. Anwar Sadat is spelled S-A-D-A-T, and then, of course, Jimmy Carter here. And then Begin, I believe, is B-E-G-I-N, but he was the leader of Israel. Anwar Sadat, leader of Egypt. Jimmy Carter, leader of the United States. They were part of the Camp David Accords. Tension got really high in the Middle East when we get the Iranian hostage crisis. If you look up in the upper part of this slide, Iran is going to take Americans hostage during the late 1970s. Iran had been friendly with the United States, but their government is going to be overthrown by a religious leader known as the Ayatollah. You don't need to know how to spell that, but just sort of know that this religious group, Muslim group, is going to overthrow the U.S.-supported government in Iran. And this is going to unleash chaos, and eventually these hostages are taken. The hostages are freed. Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980, and on the day of his inauguration, these hostages are going to be let go. For the Soviet Union during this period, they're going to have what many consider to be their Vietnam. The Soviet Union is going to try to go into Afghanistan. They're going to be in this war for a very, very long time. It's going to be a failure. The United States is going to be backing the rebels that are fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So, and believe it or not, those rebels turn out to be the Taliban later on, which, of course, that just shows you how you never know what's going to happen in history. But anyway, the Soviet Union gets bogged down in Afghanistan. They're going to lose a lot of money fighting that war. Eventually, they're going to have to leave in shame when they're not able to defeat the rebels in Afghanistan. The Cold War eventually comes to an end by the mid to late 1980s, Russia and a lot of the Soviet nations, or the Soviet Union and a lot of their allies and proxy states and satellite states, are starting to struggle under communism, and the Cold War is starting to crumble. It's going to end for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is going to be a change in leadership in the Soviet Union. We're going to see this guy come to power. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev. If you want to spell Gorbachev, it's Gorbachev. And the other was because of the strain of the arms race. Remember, we talked earlier how the United States and the Soviet Union were making a lot of nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union is going to find that they're struggling trying to keep up with the production of constantly making these missiles. So the United States is really outproducing them on that front. The war in Afghanistan is going to weaken the Soviet economy as well as the military. So it's going to weaken them tremendously. And then you're also going to see the emergence of liberation movements, where you're going to have countries like Poland and some of the others in that area that had been these satellite nations under the Soviet Union. Now they're trying to break away from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to have a hard time hanging on to these places. By 1989, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall, which you see pictured here. And this is a symbolic, remember we said this in the earlier videos, but this was a symbolic representation of the Cold War. And this marks really the beginning of the end of the Cold War. So the Berlin Wall would fall. So that is it, but let's go back and let's talk a little bit about what are some questions that you should be able to answer after going through this video, and I want you to jot these down. The first question is going to be, how did the arms race and space race develop during the Cold War? And so you can answer that by going back and looking at your notes. The second question is, why does the Red Scare occur during the period after World War II? And name some of the events that sparked the Red Scare. The next question would be, how does Cuba become a communist nation? And what does the United States do to try to stop Cuba from becoming communist? Next question is, what was the Cuban Missile Crisis? Next question would be, what were some of the steps that, or some of the events that occurred in the Middle East after World War II, where the United States tried to stop communism? And the final one is, explain how the Cold War comes to an end. Please make sure that you write these questions down and you answer them at the end of your notes. And that should do it for 7.5. Remember to start studying for your quiz, which will be coming up. For many of you, it will be coming up in the next few days, probably tomorrow. So make sure that you read over all the notes for 7.5, and there were 3 parts to it. So go back and review those notes. Look at some of those questions that you had to answer, those learning objective questions. Make sure you have answered those. If you've got any questions about the video lecture or about those questions, feel free to ask. And that's going to do it for 7.5, and I will see you guys on the next one.